Well, welcome to a special CBF podcast conversation live on Facebook and YouTube. Each week, we are bringing you stories from across the world of people doing groundbreaking and innovative work in renewing God's world. Ideas, stories, and creativity from practitioners, ministers, thinkers, authors, and more. I'm Andy Hale, CBF's podcast host, and this week we have a special Facebook and YouTube conversation with author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood and the executive coordinator of Baptist Women in Ministry. This is part of CBF's book club. You can check out more details about the books featured, including discussion guides, at cbf.net/books. In a few moments, I'll introduce our guests and we'll jump into our conversation. But we need to tell you about one of our annual sponsors, the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. Want to learn more about pastoral care in order to enhance your skills as a minister, lay leader, deacon, or member of a community, BSK's Pastoral Care Certificate allows students to earn credentials in pastoral care through short 3-course certificates. Students working towards a certificate in pastoral care will integrate knowledge and experience from both courses and experience in order to develop a deeper skills in caring for persons who are in crisis and are suffering. The certificate is a great strategy to improve one's care and counseling as congregational pastors and other congregational leaders. It will also prepare persons to serve in chaplaincy settings, whether paid or volunteer, where a degree and professional certificate in chaplaincy are not required, such as law enforcement, fire department, some prisons, and extended care facilities. The certificate requires 9-hour graduate credentials that may be rolled into a graduate degree program. BSK certificates may be continuing education for those who have already earned a graduate degree or a starting place as they consider an MDiv. Learn more at bsk.edu/options. Well, our guest for this special live conversation is Dr. Beth Allison Barr and Reverend Dr. Meredith Stone. Beth is the professor of history at Baylor University and the associate dean of graduate studies. She's also the author of several books, including The Making of Biblical Womanhood. Meredith is the executive director of Baptist Women in Ministry. She is the former associate dean of academics and assistant professor of scripture and ministry at Logsdon Seminary of Hardin-Simmons University. Dr. Barr, Dr. Stone, thank you for joining the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So great to join you all.
Well, for those that are joining us live, we want to remind you that later on in the conversation, you might have a chance for us to present a question to those being interviewed. So if you're on Facebook, you can comment to the right. If you're on YouTube, you can comment below. So Beth, how are things deep in the heart of Texas?
Well, they're hot today. I got really hot, so just in time for all the freshmen to move into Baylor next week,
Okay.
So have to welcome them with over 100 degrees.
Well, I'm sure yet another year of trying to work through how do we do this COVID thing together,
Yes.
and especially, the thought of all those students in dorms. Yeah.
Yes, and I live with them. I'm a faculty in residence, so I live with over 300 students.
Meredith, I could ask you the same question because, despite the fact that you're in a different part of Texas, Texas decided it would take up half the continental United States in land sprawl. So how are things with you?
About the same. Yeah, my girls are getting ready to go back to school. It's an interesting time to figure out how to have holistic health
Yes.
for our kids.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the serious stuff, I'd like to get y'all's hot take on something. There's this whole conversation of Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12. So, Beth, I'd love to know, do you think Baylor will finally get a chance to win the Big 12 championship if this happens? Let's get your hot take on all this.
That was a low blow there.
Yeah. Hey, y'all won the national championship in basketball.
Yeah. Yes. We win the national championship and other things. So, I don't really care as much about where we go with football. I figure there's a lot of people upset about it right now, but I sort of I wasn't sad that A&M left and then UT kind of is following them. And I'm like, okay, fine, y'all go. I'm sure we'll figure something out. So anyway, I don't know. I'm not speaking for Baylor though. That's just my own personal thoughts. Where I'm worried about it is with basketball.
Gotcha.
So.
Well, good news. This isn't live. So, the university won't hold you accountable for anything
it's okay.
that you just said. So for those of us that grew up in the conservative church tradition, we heard those token verses used to justify the exclusion of women in leadership of the church, let alone the religiously motivated practices of gender inequality. I could just close my eyes and I can remember church business meetings of my childhood in which the idea of women becoming deacons was shot down by some angry white guy who clearly had control issues, reading passages from the writings of the Apostle Paul on why women should remain silent, not teach, and certainly submit to their husbands. I asked this tongue in cheek, but are you familiar with these token texts and that are used to justify subjugated place of women, especially in the church home? But in all seriousness, why are those frequently quoted verses not saying what we think they're saying? Beth, we'll start with you.
Yes, history matters. That's what I was trying to get across in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. And so much of what we have done with women in the modern evangelical church is read our own historical circumstances back into the text. And so if we actually take those texts and look at them from the first century standpoint, what we find is Paul could not have been telling women to be silent, because he lets women speak throughout his letters. I mean, he entrusts Romans to Phoebe. He lists Junia as an apostle. And so we know that Paul's not giving a directive for women to be silent for all times, or for women not to lead, because women lead, and Paul acknowledges that they lead. So something else must be going on with these texts. And when we look at them from their historical context, what we find is that they are dealing with particular circumstances. And some of them, such as in Corinthians, Paul's using a typical rhetorical strategy where he is quoting the bad behavior of the Roman world and then correcting it and then saying, why are you doing this? So I mean, history is the reason that those texts don't say what we think they say.
Yeah, I love that you picked up on the Corinthian slogan idea with that text. That's one that I have followed as well. I mean, Paul is going throughout this book telling them, you've heard this, but hey, this is wrong.
Yeah.
You've heard this. And then right after he says it, he says, what? No. Did the word of God originate with you? And of course, the you is a second masculine plural. And so, this idea of, did the word of God originate with men, or is it something that, not Paul, but in Acts, we see all sons and daughters called to prophesy. Yes. I think that the big picture of being able to see how we have picked and how we have chosen these verses to highlight, just kind of reveals a lot about our interpretive methods.
Yes.
That we are people who do that, who do pick and choose. Because in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul says, stop drinking only water, drink a little wine, it's good for your stomach. Do we view that as a universal imperative? No, because we have done biblical interpretation. We're not reading it literally. We've done something in order to be able to understand it differently. And I think the same has been true with the way we should be reading these verses about women and taking the whole corpus into account, but we don't. And I think that I will let Beth talk about it a lot more, but I honestly think it is surrounding this preservation of power.
Yes.
That at the heart of so many decisions about the Bible and about church structure, it's preservation of power, and fear of losing that power. So
we'll get to that here in a little bit. We'll dive deep in that one. But in addition to these texts not saying what people often think they're saying, we have a cavalcade of texts that amplify and endorse gender equality and female leadership. Beth, as you mentioned, it's Phoebe who hand delivers the letter to the Roman Church. Historical precedence tells us that whoever delivered it was the one who read and preached it to the congregation. Yes. We have Paul in the letter of Galatians leveling the social playing field by saying that in Christ there is no male or female, Greek or Jew, slave or free, we're all one in Christ. I mean, for the love of God, it was women who preached to the pig-headed and fearful disciples that Jesus was not dead, but he is alive. Quite literally the most important sermon ever preached. So what are some of those other key verses we need to pay attention to? And also with that, why do you think that they are ignored by our conservative counterparts? And Meredith, we'll start with you with this question.
I think that, and I can't remember who you were calling attention to in the book as I was kind of skimming over, that we need to pay just a lot more attention to Jesus and what Jesus is doing, because we don't see any of these words coming out of Jesus's mouth, but instead he is counterculturally welcoming women disciples. We see it in Luke 8, as we talk about the disciples were following Jesus and ministering with him. And there were also some women who were a part of that big group of disciples who were supporting Jesus and joining in the work. That's one of those pictures that I feel like can completely reorient even the images that we have in our minds whenever we're thinking about Jesus's ministry. We tend to just see Jesus and then those 12 guys there, but really it was Jesus and a lot of people, men and women, who were out there doing the work together. And I think as we pay attention to some of those things in Jesus's own words and ministry, I think that could really also be helpful.
Yeah.
Beth?
No, I completely agree. I also, I think what we have done too is we've made Pauline theology inconsistent. Because when we look at what Paul's message is, Paul is calling for unity in the body of Christ. I mean, if we look in 1 Corinthians, when he talks about the body imagery and that we are all, there is no hierarchy in the body imagery. He is saying we are all important in the kingdom of God. We are all important for the working of the church, and essentially stop saying that your gift is better than another gift. He's fighting against hierarchy. And so it is so surprising to me that we are so insistent on reading hierarchy back into the text. You can even think about the creation order, which I got caught in the New Yorker saying it was one of the silliest arguments I heard. And I guess so I've got to stay with that. But it is the creation order in Genesis, using that to say that men should be the head because they were created first is such an inconsistent teaching and just doesn't make sense with any aspect of the Old Testament or the New Testament. So, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, why are we fixated on these texts? And why are we refusing to look and see where Paul calls women out as leaders? Why do we insist on seeing Martha as the hostess with the mostest when she was probably one of the, early church leaders? She ran a ministry. There's a lot of discussion about possibly what that was, but she was a leader in the early church. And it was a woman in charge of her household at that time was not the person who would have been cooking the dinner either. And so we see Martha in the way that we want to see her. And so we see her as a woman in the kitchen, serving the men who are sitting at the table and being leaders. And we totally carry that to the text. So I think it's those cultural blinders that we put on because they fit our cultural agenda. They fit what we are trying to accomplish in in our current situation. So
as you've just conveyed clearly and written on in brilliant details, so much of our conservative counterparts' understanding of gender roles stems from biblical misinterpretation, the forced agenda of cultural perspectives. However, the common churchgoer is not always equipped for biblical criticism and exegetical study. For many, they fear you're asking them to not believe in what the Bible says by looking at it critically. The attitude is, look, it's right there. It says it right there. Really at the root of these perspectives is a doctrine of biblical inerrancy. And inerrancy itself it's not a modern concept, but one that's really been driven home among evangelicals coming out of the Enlightenment in just the last 2 centuries. I guess we can dive a little deeper here. Why is theologically the doctrine of inerrancy a key piece in the mechanism of toxic masculinity and patriarchy when it comes to biblical interpretation? Beth, we'll start with you.
Yes, inerrancy is fun. I keep reminding people that inerrancy is a historical word. It's a word that has a history. It's not a word that we find in the Bible. It's not a word that we find really used until, of course, I'm a medieval historian. So, everything's modern to me after 1500. So, so it's a modern term from my perspective that we don't really see all that much before. So the question is why? Why do we do this? And I think a lot of it has to do with the multiplication of Bible translations. And because there's a lot when we think about who controls the Bible translations and the messages that they want to convey, and we think about with the Reformation, and we think about the Geneva Bible, in which the translation was controlled by a lot of seditious people who were upset with the kings and with the divine right of kings, and so they were attempting to convey a message in the text that they used. And this was actually something that people learned, that we can control the narrative about what people believe by controlling the text of the Bible. I mean, this is a really scary lesson that we see people learned in the Reformation. And I think it really came home like in the 19th century, where we see a lot of what we call, this conservative biblical womanhood is really born in the 19th century. And it's at a time when masculine power, if we think about in Western Europe, where women were legally the status of children, and there was a great effort poured into keeping women out of leadership positions, keeping women out of political positions, keeping women out of education, not allowing them to take, essentially when work moved outside the home, the problem is you had to have somebody to take care of the home, so that the work could continue. And if you allowed women to move outside of the home, like men did with the work, then who's going to do those other jobs? And so what we see is this very clear structures created to try to create these roles where women are divinely ordained to be in the home, whereas men are divinely ordained to work outside the home. And the Bible is adjusted to fit that. So, which I think, if we can get that point across to folk, that actually what they are reading in the Bible is not actually what, that there has been so much done to these texts in the Bible to make them say possibly the opposite of what they intended. So, it's the literal and plain and literal interpretation is really the interpretation that wasn't what Paul intended, which I find highly ironic.
Yeah, kind of harken back to, at some point during the printing, this idea of the authorized version of the Bible gets put in one copy of King James Version. And, for every century after that, this is the text. Meredith, take us a little deeper here too, looking at why the theology of the doctrine of inerrancy is a key piece on the mechanism of toxic masculinity and patriarchy when it comes to biblical interpretation.
In some ways, I think that inerrancy became what it is out of fear. Yes. People, I think, tend to feel like if you begin to shake a little bit on something that they feel like is their foundation, that the whole thing's going to fall apart. And when we start trying to look at passages with a critical eye to history, with a critical eye to context, then for a lot of people that feels like we're shaking the leg on their chair, and that if that chair, if it gets too loose, it's going to collapse. And so the Bible has been so tied to our identity and the way we understand it in Christ. And so that idea of inerrancy helps people have that assurance of, I'm believing the right thing, everything's going to be okay, rather than having a desire to really grow. There's a comfort in saying, we got it. We've got the authority. We've got the authorized kind of idea. And this helped the people who were in power structures to be able to say, that is the way it is. You have to read it this way, which is interesting because for Baptists, we come out of this tradition of the priesthood of all believers, but really inerrancy became this tool that was coming down from power to say, this is the way you have to interpret it in order to be right. rather than truly honoring that soul freedom that we talk about so much as Baptists. So I think it became a tool. People, they know how foundational the Bible is to the way we understand our faith, and that consciously or unconsciously helped power to maintain the boundaries that it wanted to maintain so that it stayed in power, which was white males.
Yes, I mean, it's tied up with racism. I mean, we have to put that
absolutely,
with it
absolutely.
Inerrancy was used to keep, slaves, to maintain slave ownership, or the concept of this. We have to read the text this literally, because that is what they built, the American South on. So.
Just two small personal notes. Number one, as I'm sitting here taking notes, I'm laughing at myself because as if I can't watch this later on. Instead, I'm writing down what y'all are saying as you're saying it. Like, this is amazing. The second thing is, Meredith, I love when you put rightness in quotes. Like, totally, that was the whole reason. Like, yeah, we want to be right. We want to be in control, which, maybe pushes us a little further down, in the conversation of, at its core, is inerrancy really just about control and lack of faith? And really, is it about idolizing the Bible versus worshiping the God that inspired it?
I think that is a great insight. I tend to, I used to say to my students, there's a reason it's called faith and not certainty.
Right.
We want it to be certainty, but there's a reason why it's faith. We have to have belief. It's okay when things don't fit together, because that's when we actually have to have faith. But instead, it's been turned into something that we have to have the scientific method and the proof and all of these things to line up. And I really like a God that is inviting faith. And giving space for that relationship to evolve.
Yeah.
Peter Enns got a brilliant book called The Sin of Certainty. And
I was just thinking that.
Yeah, it takes us so deep. So if you know that the sacred texts are influenced by the culture they're written, and if we know that these texts were written in a highly patriarchal society, then how do we equip our people to see that sifting out and setting aside the patriarchal lens of the writers is a part of being faithful to the text? Meredith, we'll start with you.
Oh, I thought that was going to be a Beth start question. Let her start on this one.
All right, Beth, you go. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, I think we don't have to worry about the patriarchy that's in the text. I mean, they're written in a patriarchal world. And patriarchy is clearly, has been with us from the beginning of history. I think what we can see is that even within the patriarchy of the Bible, we see God always raising up women, and we see God always pushing women and elevating them in ways that their patriarchal world would not have normally done. And so we have this very clear line, that we can trace throughout the Bible. I mean, I think about Hagar. Hagar, who is, if we think about the impact of patriarchy on a woman's life, I mean, she was essentially put in a situation she didn't want to be in. She was raped. She had the child that they wanted, but then she was thrown out because, she was abandoned. She did everything that they wanted her to do, not of her own decision. And she was, treated as property because that's the way that she was regarded. And we have God comes to her and says he's going to take care of her. And she says, you are a God who sees. And God sees women. God sees women in the way that culture, that history does not see women. And it's just remarkable to me. It's really hard for me to read the Bible without seeing how God sees women. So I guess the patriarchy in the Bible doesn't bother me, because I know that the Bible was written through people and that God allows, it speaks in the culture, the time that it was written. But then we also see this amazing, in every aspect of the Bible, we see God seeing women and raising women up and helping women in ways that their culture wouldn't have really done. So I don't know if that helps. So I guess it doesn't bother me to point out the patriarchy in the Bible, because running alongside it is this thread of God seeing women.
Yeah, I think this goes back to your part of your question before, which was for our people who don't have the critical tools for interpreting the Bible, how do we help them understand what's going on here? And I think that even for folks who aren't necessarily reading the commentaries or reading all of these different aspects of the text, simply by asking folks to read the text closely and remove their preconceived notions about it, they're going to realize how much their interpretations have been influenced by what other people have told them.
Yeah.
All you have to do is sit down and read a few verses into Mark and go, wait a second, where's the birth narrative? How is this a picture of Jesus without the birth narrative? To realize that has been implanted in us as you can't know the story unless you know the birth narrative. Well, Mark's readers did. They knew who Jesus was and what Jesus was doing. And so it kind of reveals that effect that all of the teaching, all of the cultural forces have even had on our interpretation, just the same way that they were having the force on the writing, the translation of the Bible itself. And so just as Beth said, I always like to help people by thinking in terms of the plurality that we see within the Bible. In one place, you'll see that this kind of predeterministic theology of if you do this bad things are going to happen to you. But then in the Bible, you see where this guy, Job, does no bad thing and bad things still happen to him. And that's in the same Bible. So we get a plurality that helps us understand the interpretation that's necessary when we see women like Deborah and Huldah, and the wise women of Tekoa in the Old Testament. We see them existing alongside the laws, which have these wild things that they are saying about women, where you have to marry your rapist. And we're not asking people to read that literally. We're doing interpretation. So even just thinking about how do I remove some of those preconceived ideas and then think about the plurality that we find within the library that is the Bible itself can help us to see a lot goes into our interpretive efforts.
Yeah.
I like to remind folks around here during crawfish season, if we really want to hold true to the Levitical laws, and we don't want to be an abomination and enjoy those crawfish. So
that's not going to get you very far.
No. Yeah, they're fantastic though. So we want to remind those watching this live that you can submit a question by commenting on the post. And hey, we need to pause to tell you about another bear mascot for a university, which is this podcast is presented to you by Mcafee School of Theology at Mercer University, who exists to train ministers who inspire the church and the world to imagine, discover, and create God's future. Located in Atlanta, Georgia, the Mcafee School of Theology offers doctoral and master degree programs, including a fully online Master of Divinity degree, the only fully online MDiv offered by a national research university. You can visit their website, theology.mercer.edu, to learn more about their programs and their scholarships. So, not to put anybody else in the hot seat, but I wonder what would happen if the Mercer Bears faced off against the Baylor Bears.
Well, one of my professors, when I was a student at Baylor, I was an undergrad at Baylor. He went to Mercer as provost, I believe. He was one of the professors that shepherded me through. So I always think of him when I see Mercer.
Hey, additional love to one of our great sponsors. So in the book, you lay out the evidence of how culture has influenced biblical interpretation. And it's so ironic that conservative Christians especially talk about being in the world but not of the world, and yet their cultural views of marriage and gender roles maybe have shaped their biblical views versus the Bible shaping their view of these things. So walk us through some of the key cultural moments that have promoted the patriarchal worldview. Let's start with the time of biblical composition. Beth, walk us through some of the examples here.
Well, I mean, in the Greco-Roman world, in the ancient world, women were considered to be inferior to men. Literally, their bodies were inferior. This is not, the Greco-Roman world isn't the only culture that promotes this, but it was very, this idea that women's bodies are not formed as well as men, that they are imperfect men, and that the reason that women are weaker because their bodies are not formed well. I mean, we have, Aristotle, he says it's a happy circumstance because otherwise we wouldn't have procreation. But at the same time, that there's something wrong with women. And this was the idea that was carried through the medieval world. I mean, the medieval world also did not allow women to be ordained. I use the word ordained lightly because ordination has a history too. And so it really doesn't come about until the central Middle Ages, where we have firm ideas in the Western Church about ordination. But nonetheless, women couldn't be ordained because their bodies were seen as impure. And they were weaker than men's, and they were not as perfect as men's. But at the same time, the medieval world also saw that women could overcome those weaknesses with their body. That, the reason women can't have the same authority as men in the church is because their bodies are broken. But if a woman overcomes her broken body, then she can have the authority of men. And this is how they explained Mary Magdalene. This is how they explained all of those amazing virgin martyr saints who killed dragons and preached on the shores of France and converted thousands of people to Christianity. These were women who overcame their feminine weakness and were able to speak with the authority of men and with, the approval of God. After the Reformation, though, an interesting thing happens with the priesthood of all believers. And I write in the book that the Reformation theology really should have set women free, because it said that women are made in the image of God, just like men, and that women are, come to God just like men. They don't need an intercessor in between them. But the problem with this is that then what would keep women from being preachers? What would keep women? And we have all these great 17th century women, all these Baptist preaching women who thought that they could do this because Reformation theology set them free. But the patriarchal constraints of their world held them back. And they had to come up with a new idea about why women couldn't preach, teach, and lead. And this is when they introduce this new idea that it is the divinely created space for women to be separate from men, that women, instead of women being broken men, women are now created so differently from men that they have a completely different purpose. And women's purpose, because their bodies give birth to children, that's their job. That's their only job. And so their job is to take care of the home and children and support men. And so we see this evolution of this new idea to maintain this old structure of patriarchy, that women are divinely created by God to be less than men, or to have a different role from men. Separate but equal language. I don't understand how modern Christians don't hear women are equal in image but separate in roles, and don't hear the civil rights movement. I mean, I just don't understand how we don't hear that. But in the 19th century, this language about women being separate and being divinely created different really became entrenched itself in Western Christianity. And we got a little bit away from it after the suffrage movement and with the coming of World War I. But after World War II, we needed to get those men back into jobs, and we see the language revert itself back to women are created differently from men. Women are created for home, men are created for work. And the Christianity latches on to this message. And we begin to see, as Baptists know well, we begin to see the push of women out of the pulpit in the 1970s. At the same time that the Equal Rights Amendment is being defeated. So, I mean, all of these historical puzzle pieces just fit together to let us see that what is going on with biblical womanhood and women's roles in the church has much more to do with history than it does to do with the Bible.
I find it so interesting, the argument that if we are to empower women, we're actually giving into culture. Because if you look at studies of even
Yes.
2021, there's still a bias that exists against women in the workplace,
Yes.
a bias against women in leadership. And so it's the opposite. We are actually countercultural when we are empowering women.
That's exactly right.
But in the same way that you mentioned about the women finding a way, right,
Yeah.
to alter
Yeah.
their bodies or whatever, I think we see something similar today when women try to adopt some of the characteristics or ways that are typically associated with masculine and are able to try and negotiate their world in that way. And I think especially probably in the early time as women in ministry were really starting to get going, I've heard a lot of women say, I was only taught to preach as a man. I was only taught to
Yes.
preach by men and how men preach.
Yeah.
I never heard women's voices. I never knew that I could have my own voice, that I could lead in a way that is truly me, whether that be culturally feminine or culturally masculine, that I could lead out of an authentic voice to who I am. And I feel like that's the goal that I wish somehow we could get to. Because we see it today, in this way of negotiating, of trying to mimic those in power that helps move us forward. But that's exactly just reinforcing in some ways that power structure. And we want to find that way where we can each express the way we've been created in the image of God in order to participate in what God's doing in the world.
Yes.
So we mentioned some, ancient aspects. We kind of worked our way at least up to the 70s. What are some modern cultural influences of the patriarchal worldview among Christians today? Meredith, we'll let you take first glance at this one.
I think that I don't know that you can truly separate today from the 70s, 80s, 90s. While I think it is not as prevalently talked about, I think there still is an undercurrent. So many of our structures that exist today in our organizations were built upon foundations that were patriarchal in nature before women had opportunity to be a part of the building of the very institutions that we live in right now. So many of our congregations began in the 19th century, maybe the 20th century. And our founding documents, church bylaws, church constitutions are going to be reflective of that structural patriarchy that is in effect. And so I think that while it may be a little less in the forefront, it still exists. And there are still things structurally that need to be addressed in our present day in order to begin cultivating environments in our organizations, our institutions, and our congregations that are truly empowering all people created in God's image.
Yeah.
Beth?
Yeah, no, while you were talking, Meredith, I was thinking about the WMU. The WMU was a really powerful force for Baptist women. And when it was at the height of sort of its authority and I don't know if the control is the right word, but its influence in the Baptist church is in the early 20th century. And this is also the time that we see more Baptist women in the pulpit, and that we see Baptist women who are leaders in the early church. And I can't help think as a historian that it has something to do with that female organization in the church that really did wield power equal to the deacons. And so we had a body of women that were able to make decisions on their own within the church, that were able to to have a voice that was listened to by the male leaders in the church. So even if they weren't the deacons, they were as influential as the deacons in many churches. I mean, that's one of the things we also see in history, is that women may not always carry the titles that men do, but they often do the work and sometimes have the influence and authority of men. And so we see this with the WMU. But if we look in churches today, Baptist churches today, the WMU is a thing of the past. It's not something that is really, really lost influence in the latter half of the 20th century. And part of this, I think, was this growing conservative, I have to say this carefully, but it was the growing conservative movement on the importance of the family and the importance that women's primary job was to their children and not beyond, because the WMU called women, really, your work is beyond your family. It's beyond, that's part of it, but it was outward looking. And what we saw happening in the 70s and 80s is an inward focus on inside churches where everybody was to turn to their family. And that was what you're supposed to focus on. That's your first ministry. And we see some of these mission organizations and these, these outward-looking organizations like the WMU, they disappear, and with them also disappears a lot of women's influence within the modern church. So I don't know. That may have been a tangent, but that's what I was thinking about, Meredith. I was just like, oh my gosh, can we revive the WMU?
Yeah, and along those lines, when we look at the history of Baptist Women in Ministry as an organization, it really grew out of the strength of the WMU. At the time, Carolyn Weatherford Crumpler was leading the national WMU group, and she was formative in arranging some of the conferences and was one of the founding mothers of Baptist Women in Ministry. So it was a place where women were able to find that strength and empowerment.
Yes.
And then they actually wanted to use it in various ways. And so in many ways, I think of WMU as an origin point for what we're doing today as Baptist Women in Ministry.
No, it is. And with the disappearance of the WMU too, we see a change in church service structure where the focal point of most services is really the sermon that focuses on the male body, the male preacher, in many of these conservative churches, whereas the space that some of these other organizations often had, like the WMU, that would often read the meeting notes or would give the prayer or would do things like that in the service, and don't do it anymore. And so the emphasis on the emphasis eroded to just a handful of only the male leaders who were left on the stage. So,
in my mind, I left the world of toxic conservatism a long time ago. And yet what I failed to see is that I'm both the beneficiary of toxic masculinity and its legacy is still prevalent in our congregations today. So while many, if not most of those listening to this conversation have been on board with what both of you have had to say, we may not realize just how much patriarchy has invasive roots in our lives. So can you speak to the most common unseen ways in which toxic masculinity still exists in our churches today? And Beth, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't know if it's unseen. Just go pull up the Baptist churches in your area and scroll through the pictures of the staff. And even in churches that with their mouth support women in ministry, but they don't hire women. They don't, women for some reason are not as called as often as men are called to Baptist churches. There at one point, a couple of years ago, there were like more than 400 Baptist churches in Texas. You might know this better. I just remember reading this and just being appalled that didn't have a pastor. And there's more women than that who have recognized the call in their life and have been ordained, who simply aren't being hired by those churches. So, I think that's we've got to put our money where our mouth is. And in order, if we believe women are called to preach, teach, and lead, we need to let women preach, teach, and lead. And we need to figure out what's going on in our churches that's keeping us from hiring women and keeping us from putting women in leadership positions. So
hold tight, because we're gonna spend a second where we're gonna zero in and we're gonna magnify our beloved fellowship itself and talk about that. But Meredith, go ahead with the question.
Yeah, I want to say this delicately, but I also feel like sometimes it's okay to call some things out. in the Baptist churches that I know, Andy, as you're talking about, some of our strongest male supporters of women in ministry, I'll hear something like, "Oh, we don't need to have women preach regularly. We had a woman preach last year." and it's not enough. We're trying to swing the pendulum to help people reimagine leadership, to help people reimagine what God's beloved community looks like. And one time every couple of years is not going to be enough. Another thing that I hear is, well, we just want to treat women equally to how we treat men. That's a good first step, but it's not going to get us that pendulum swing that we need. We need equitable treatment. And so I thought that whenever the stories came out about Dr. Jill Biden and wanting to be called doctor, and how that resonated within our community, I thought it was very brave of Mark Wingfield with Baptist News Global to say, "I didn't get it before, I get it now." That he used to tell the pastoral residents who were women, "Oh, we don't do titles. You don't need to have people call you pastor or reverend. We just call everybody by their first name." And that he now is doing an about face and saying, "I get it. Even if we didn't do it for men, we need to do it for women, because women our community needs to hear that from us so that they can know that women are in leadership in that place." And I think that's part of that equity that we're seeking, which has to swing the pendulum a little bit, so that even, I appreciate the question, Andy, even our strongest male supporters can be figuring out ways to go a little further.
Yeah.
When that whole thing with Joe Biden came out, selfishly, I'm getting an EDD right now. So I was like, hey, my bruised ego needs to be called doctor too. So we need to recognize this as an official degree. So I am so proud to be part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, a network of churches that over 30 years ago said, we believe that women too are called to ministry. We also have less than 7% of our congregations with female senior pastors. So it's sad that I can say on just a couple of hands, pastors, which are profound influencers, mentors, and colleagues of mine. I think of people like Carol McIntyre, and Courtney Allen Crump, and Emily Hull McGee, just to name a few. The lack of female senior pastors in CBF life is overwhelming evidence unto itself that patriarchy still has deep roots in our congregations, whether we realize it or whether we want to admit to it. So how do congregations begin to identify gender inequality blind spots? Meredith, will you go first on this one?
Yeah, I think for a long time we've talked about helping churches put women in senior leadership positions. And we need to keep talking about that. We need to absolutely be doing that. But I think we might begin to see even more growth in that area if we also start working on our congregational cultures. For so many churches, they're open to women in ministry. Maybe they've had women deacons for years that they've ordained. They've had women on staff, but they haven't done some of that really hard work of paying attention to every space within their congregation and doing the work to make those more egalitarian spaces. So then when it comes time to hire a senior pastor, we either hear, well, we're just not ready yet, or we'll have a church that takes a leap of faith and does hire a woman, but then she gets there and the culture is so permeated by the patriarchal structures that have been there that she just faced obstacle after obstacle. And so I think we're going to begin to make even more progress as we do both, as we continue to advocate and push for the women to be in senior leadership positions, which helps so much in creating those imaginations. But we also think ground up, and we also begin to think, how can we transform our congregational culture, swing that pendulum, so that when it does come time for senior leadership, it truly is, while some would say, we just consider women and men equally, well, if we're really going to consider women and men equally, then we have to think about the women differently. That's equity. We're going to have to look at their resumes differently. We're going to have to realize that they have had obstacles that male candidates haven't had. And I think if we do the work in our congregational cultures, that can help us begin to take that next step.
Beth?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Recently I read not too long ago, and it was just so accurate. I read Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer's, A Church Called Tove, and one of the things they argue in it is that church culture has to change before we really are going to start getting women in leadership positions, which is exactly what Meredith said. So why are we going to have a church accept a woman to preach every Sunday if most of the people in the congregation haven't heard women teach or preach on any sort of regular basis? I mean, why do we expect that they may realize that women can do this job really well if we haven't had women on our finance committees showing that they know how to keep accounting of the church? If we don't have them in every space of leadership showing that even if they might do it differently than men, they can do it and they can do the job, then we're not going to be ready to have a woman in the pulpit because the church congregation still has not seen a woman doing those things. So, I think what Meredith said is exactly right. We have to get in all of those areas of our churches, we have to let women lead, and we have to let women lead with their gifts. In all of the spaces that may have traditionally been male.
There's a fascinating part of the book when you write about the connection between racism and patriarchy. And that is a conversation that we could dedicate a whole live, conversation unto itself. In the book, you use the terminology of layered oppression. What is the intersectionality of these two things, racism and patriarchy?
Yeah, well, they simply go together. This is something that women's historians have known from the very beginning. Gerda Lerner, in her really great The Creation of Patriarchy, one of the things is that she found is that the emphasis on hierarchies, on patriarchal hierarchies, goes along with an emphasis that some people within that culture are better than other people, are more able to lead than other people, which is racism. And so they simply go together. You can't disconnect them whatsoever. And it also plays into, if we think about racism in the US and we think about church culture in the US, I have a good historian friend who said with the civil rights movement, she said, hey, look, when these conservative places couldn't say they were better than Black people anymore, then they had to say that at least they were better than women. And so, it's sort of this power structure. And the intersectionality of it is that Black women have this double burden on them. Not only do they have the pressure of racism on them, but then they also have the pressure of being a woman in a male space. And so Black women have an even harder, this is something too I think about why the Making a Biblical Woman it's exploded out there in a way I never could have imagined. But there's a lot of Black women's voices who have said similar things who aren't getting at all the attention that I'm getting. And I'm white. I'm a white woman, and I would be blind to think that wasn't part of the reason. I really tried to bring out, Betty Collier Thomas wrote just an amazing book years ago called Daughters of Thunder, where she just brought out all these Black female preacher voices from the 19th and the 20th century. And this book is so out of print that it costs like hundreds of dollars to even try to find a copy of it. And, it didn't sell very much at all when it first came out. Nobody cared about Black women preaching. Those are structural problems that we have to figure out. Why don't we buy Black women's books? Why don't we listen to Black women preaching? So we've got to address that. And it has to do with these power dynamics. And so even as, we're three white people sitting here, and we have to realize the power dynamics that has enabled us to have a voice where people of color do not. So I mean, it's a hard lesson. It's something that we have to be conscious of. And it's a question I ask myself all the time: why does my voice matter here? And a lot of it is because, you know, I'm a white woman, and that's why people are listening to me more.
Well, we also have to point out the irony that we're talking about patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and the making of women, biblical womanhood, and I'm on this conversation. So
it's okay. I
Yeah.
mean, we all have to be part of the solution. So
Meredith,
Yeah.
thoughts on the question?
I think that was a beautiful answer. Yeah, power breeds power. When it's seductive, and I think that it's one of the reasons we see abuses of power in leadership positions, even within congregations, because power breeds power, and so that's a part of patriarchy and racism being tied so closely together. But my experience of patriarchy is not my Black and brown sisters' experience of patriarchy.
Right.
And so we absolutely have to listen to them. Some of the voices that have influenced me most would be Renita Weems, Shanika Walker Barnes, Wilfa Gaffney.
Yes.
These are women who are writing in that space and really challenging white women who we have the best intentions, but sometimes we wind up not seeing the way our privilege is giving us that advantage. And so we have to be very mindful of it, and we repent whenever we do that, and we own it with one another, and then we go back and we listen, and we try to find ways not just to reconcile, but to repair what we have done.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And anyway, there's so many. I was thinking of Clarice Martin, who is this, you know, fantastic historian who wrote this, one of the best articles I've ever read on why Paul's not telling women to submit, and she ties it into racism, and she calls out Black preachers who still preach female subordination, but then do not, you know, then of course say it doesn't matter for the passages about slavery. And she's like, how can you even do that? So these fantastic voices that we've ignored as a white church community.
I'd be remiss too if we talk about, you know, the layers of patriarchy and discrimination, is certainly that extends to homophobia and discrimination against the LGBTQ community, which again, that conversation unto itself could be an entire conversation when it comes to patriarchy. So not to skirt that, simply maybe we can have that conversation next time, either one of these, pick these up. Get to our last question here, which is, in CBF life, many have experienced fundamentalism and the attacks of fundamentalists. They have questioned our faith. They've said that we don't believe the Bible and treated us as not real Christians. Beth, you're now on the receiving end of really personal attacks from fundamentalists, now dubbed Theo Bros. What are you learning from how you handle this type of crisis and conflict?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So, you know, what we have to realize, and Meredith said this early on, is I have to remember that they're speaking from a place of fear, that I've just challenged what their identity is based on. And so, and that actually does help me when I think about it, because sometimes I think uncharitable thoughts about some of these people. And then I think about it and I'm like, you know what, they're afraid. And I can understand when I've been uncharitable because I've been afraid. And they're afraid because their God is small. And they don't realize yet that God is big enough for this. And that God has always called women. And if they recognize that, then, as I said, it's going to completely, it's going to pull the rug out of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I mean, why else do they exist? Except for it's going to pull the rug out of the Gospel Coalition. I mean, it's written into their gospel statement that you have to believe in male headship and female subordination. It's going to pull the plug on the ESV. So it's power, and they're afraid. And so I try to remember that. I try to remember that to help me be charitable about it. Sometimes I'm not always successful in that. But at the same time, the people there are more people who have read my book who it has helped.
Mm.
And that actually I know, because I'm like, okay, I knew this was coming because I challenged this power structure, but it's helping women. And so at the end of the day, I just remember, I read all my messages that I've gotten from women all over the place, just telling me how much it's helped them. So
do that. Keep that in mind. Yeah, there's
yeah.
one woman who recently graduated from the seminary where I taught, that this book has been something that she felt like not only empowered her and gave her this freedom to own her ministry, but which she just started buying copies of and sending to people everything they would say, because it is so accessible and it is helping people to understand something that maybe we haven't presented in this way, that really people can read and hear these stories. And so kudos to you for keeping that Jesus-like attitude, and keep remembering you have done a great work here.
Thank you. Yeah, I try. I don't always. There are moments that I think uncharitable thoughts.
Don't we all?
Yeah, at the same time, I'm sitting here thinking, listen to Meredith give you high praise. And, Meredith is the head of an organization that is pushing congregations forward. And she absorbs so many slings and arrows from small-minded control freaks who don't believe in, essentially, I would say, the Bible. So Meredith, kudos and all heaps and praises to you for the way that you take many of the blows so that others can propel themselves forward in ministry. So we need to pause to tell you about our final sponsor, which is not going to play Baylor in any kind of way of sports. So we'll stop bringing you back to Baylor sports. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Congregational Health, whose mission is to help faith communities and their leaders thrive. Healthy congregations can transform their communities to be compassionate, more faithful, and just, utilizing a highly skilled network of consultants and intentional interim ministers. The center supports congregations and ministry leaders to address the challenges they faced. Visit their website, healthychurch.org, to learn more about the center and can be your trusted partner in ministry. Well, the book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood. Our guests have been Beth Allison Barr and Meredith Stone. You can check out their respective works at bethallisonbarr.com and bwim.info. Dr. Barr, Reverend Dr. Stone, thank you for making the time to have this conversation. We are grateful for your revolutionary wisdom, voice, and leadership in making a more just and equitable world.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, that's it. That's our conversation. If you want to subscribe to our CBF podcast on all major platforms, including iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, SoundCloud, don't forget to like and share this episode on your favorite social media platform. Be sure to support our annual sponsors by visiting their website. Again, that's the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, the Center for Congregational Health, Mcafee School of Theology's Doctorate of Ministry program. Check out cbf.net for more information about church starters, field personnel, advocacy work, and much more.